To comprehend the rise and fall of the rogue traders militant, one must first understand the era in which they thrived. The Imperium of Man, a vast and uncompromising empire stretching across the galaxy, is an entity built on expansion, conquest, and control. From its earliest days, the Imperium relied on those willing to push into the unknown, venturing beyond the borders of imperial dominion to seek new opportunities, resources, and threats. This expansion was not always executed by the Emperor's legions or the formal might of the Imperial Navy. Instead, a unique class of individuals, rogue traders, took the helm of this grand endeavor. Rogue traders were granted something few in the Imperium could ever dream of: authority to operate beyond the rigid doctrines of the Adeptus Terra. Their charters, often issued by the Emperor himself or later by High Lords of Terra, gave them the right to explore, conquer, and exploit worlds outside the Imperium's established borders. They were, in many ways, the frontier lords of the galaxy, bridging the gap between the Imperium and the unknown. But while most rogue traders were merchants, explorers, and opportunists, there was a special breed among them, those who did not just seek fortune but sought dominion through war. These were the rogue traders militant. The concept of a rogue trader militant was born from necessity. There were always threats beyond the Imperium's borders that could not be pacified through diplomacy or trade. Xenos empires, heretical human enclaves, and rogue elements had to be dealt with, often through force. Some rogue traders, granted immense military resources, took on the mantle of warlords, leading private armies, fleets, and even entire war campaigns in the name of the Imperium. They operated in the wild, lawless void where the rule of the Emperor was more of a whispered threat than an absolute commandment. Unlike the formal branches of the Imperium's war machine, these militant explorers were not bound by strict chain-of-command hierarchies. They wielded autonomy few could comprehend, making pacts with alien species one moment and exterminating entire civilizations the next. Some carved out minor empires of their own, enforcing their version of imperial law, while others became infamous for their unchecked brutality, acting more like warlords than servants of the Emperor. With their power, influence, and self-sufficiency, some even began to rival the authority of sector governors, forging their own destinies outside the watchful eye of the High Lords of Terra. But the history of the rogue traders militant is not one of uninterrupted triumph. As the Imperium grew more bureaucratic and centralized, the unrestricted power they wielded became an issue. While they had once been seen as a necessary evil, over time they became a liability. Their ambitions often clashed with those of the Adeptus Terra, their actions inviting both scrutiny and condemnation. Some became too powerful, too independent, and too dangerous to be allowed to exist unchecked. What then led to their ultimate decline? Was it internal strife, betrayal, or the inevitable tightening of the Imperium's iron grip? The story of their rise and fall is one of ambition, conflict, and the ever-present struggle between individual power and the demands of an empire that tolerates no rivals. This is the tale of the rogue traders militant, a tale of glory, war, and inevitable downfall. The key players in the history of the rogue traders militant were a mixture of powerful individuals, imperial institutions, and external forces that influenced their fate. These figures and factions shaped the trajectory of their rise and fall, whether by granting them authority, opposing their expansion, or becoming entangled in their ambitions. At the center of it all were the rogue traders themselves. Unlike ordinary rogue traders, those classified as militant were more than just explorers or traders. They were commanders of fleets, rulers of distant holdings, and warlords in all but name. Each was granted a warrant that allowed them vast operational freedom, often exceeding the influence of planetary governors or even entire subsectors. Some controlled personal armies, bolstered by Imperial Guard veterans, planetary militia, or even renegade forces. Others commanded fleets rivaling those of the Imperial Navy, consisting of repurposed warships, salvaged relics, and vessels acquired through unconventional means. They acted with near-absolute authority in their territories, sometimes enforcing imperial rule, other times bending the law to suit their own purposes. The High Lords of Terra played a crucial role in shaping the policies that determined the fate of the rogue traders Militant. As the highest governing body of the Imperium, they issued charters that granted these warlords legitimacy, but also dictated the limits of their authority. While some factions within the Council saw value in their existence, others viewed them as a threat to imperial stability. Their influence extended through various Adeptus organizations, ensuring that control over the galaxy remained firmly in their grasp. The Imperial Navy was both a benefactor and a competitor to the rogue traders Militant. In many instances, they cooperated, with rogue trader fleets acting as auxiliaries in distant campaigns. However, the Navy's rigid hierarchy and adherence to structured command made them uneasy about these independent commanders. The existence of private war fleets operating beyond the standard military framework was a constant source of tension, with some naval officers advocating for their complete dissolution. Clashes between the two were not uncommon, particularly in regions where rogue traders built their own power bases, sometimes rivaling the influence of sector admirals. The Adeptus Terra, responsible for the Imperium's vast bureaucracy, played an indirect but significant role. The Administratum tracked and taxed their holdings, while the Arbites ensured that imperial law was upheld, at least in theory. The Adeptus Ministorum had a more complex relationship with the rogue traders Militant, as many used their influence to spread the imperial creed, while others clashed with the ecclesiarchy over ideological differences. Some rogue traders promoted unorthodox interpretations of the faith, leading to conflicts with more puritanical elements within the Church. The Inquisition was another faction that maintained an interest in the activities of the rogue traders Militant. While some inquisitors saw them as useful tools in combating threats beyond the Imperium's borders, others viewed their autonomy as a breeding ground for heresy. Their unchecked power, dealings with Xenos, and willingness to exploit forbidden knowledge put them under suspicion. Some rogue traders found themselves declared heretics, while others were secretly backed by inquisitors who saw the value in their operations. This complex relationship meant that while some were targeted for elimination, others operated under the protection of powerful patrons within the Inquisition. Beyond the structures of the Imperium, external threats played a defining role in the story of the rogue traders Militant. Various Xenos empires encountered their expansionist efforts, resulting in both alliances and conflicts. Some traders forged agreements with alien species, gaining access to advanced technology and resources, while others waged war against them, exterminating entire civilizations to claim their territories. The Orcs, with their ever-present warbands, were frequent adversaries, often requiring entire fleets to counter their invasions. The Eldar, elusive and enigmatic, sometimes aided rogue traders in pursuit of their own goals, but just as often saw them as reckless interlopers. Rebel human factions were another key element. Many rogue traders came into contact with lost human civilizations, some of which had developed in isolation for millennia. Some willingly rejoined the Imperium under their rule, while others resisted fiercely. Rogue traders Militant often engaged in wars of conquest against these breakaway human enclaves, but not all conflicts ended in subjugation. Some traders defied imperial mandates, allying with these rogue states, leading to accusations of treason and, in some cases, outright war against imperial forces. Another often overlooked group in this history was the Mechanicum of Mars. While the Mechanicum had a deep interest in exploration and technological recovery, their stance on rogue traders Militant was mixed. Some were eager to sponsor expeditions, supplying war machines and technological expertise, while others saw them as reckless opportunists who risked exposing forbidden knowledge. This led to complex relationships where some traders enjoyed privileged access to Mechanicum resources, while others faced opposition from its priesthood. Planetary governors and sector lords also played a role, particularly as the influence of certain rogue traders grew beyond what was considered acceptable. While some planetary rulers saw them as allies in securing their domains, others viewed them as potential rivals. Political struggles emerged as rogue traders expanded their influence, sometimes being seen as more reliable than the official imperial hierarchy. In some cases, entire sectors became dependent on their military power, leading to conflicts with established authorities who sought to rein them in. While the rogue traders Militant stood at the center of this complex web of factions, they were never truly independent. They operated in a galaxy where every faction, from the highest echelons of the Imperium to the hostile forces beyond, had a stake in their rise and fall. Their ultimate fate would be shaped not just by their own ambitions, but by the shifting balance of power among those who sought to control or eliminate them. The emergence of the rogue traders Militant was not a sudden development, but rather the result of a series of escalating circumstances that shaped the Imperium's approach to expansion and control. Several key factors contributed to their rise, each tied to the Imperium's relentless pursuit of dominion over the galaxy. One of the primary drivers behind their creation was the necessity of expanding beyond the established borders of Imperial space. The Imperium's hunger for new worlds, resources, and strategic holdings had always been insatiable. However, its traditional means of expansion, large-scale military campaigns led by formal branches of the Imperial war machine, were often too slow and cumbersome. Mobilizing the Imperial Guard and Navy for every expansionist effort was logistically demanding, and the Imperium's leadership recognized the need for a more flexible alternative. Rogue traders, with their autonomy and self-sufficiency, were seen as a practical solution to this issue. While standard rogue traders focused on exploration and commerce, those classified as militant were expected to take a more aggressive approach, securing newly discovered worlds by force when necessary. The decentralization of power beyond the Imperium's core sectors also played a significant role. In the distant reaches of space, where the grip of Imperial authority was weaker, traditional methods of governance were ineffective. Many of these regions harbored threats that could not be dealt with through bureaucracy alone. The Imperium's rigid institutions struggled to maintain control over its ever-expanding borders, and in response, it turned to those who could act with near-total independence. Rogue traders Militant were given the authority to act as warlords in these lawless territories, their primary function being to bring order through conquest. The need for rapid response forces capable of dealing with emergent threats was another crucial factor. While the Imperial Navy and the Astra Militarum were the backbone of the Imperium's military strength, their deployments were often constrained by administrative oversight and strategic priorities elsewhere. The Imperium faced constant pressure from Xenos incursions, rebellious human enclaves, and internal uprisings in frontier territories. Rogue traders Militant, with their privately maintained fleets and armies, provided a means of immediate intervention in conflicts that would otherwise spiral out of control before the Imperium could react. Their ability to wage independent wars meant that Imperial interests could be defended without diverting large-scale forces from other theaters of war. The Imperium's relationship with alien civilizations also contributed to their necessity. While outright extermination of Xenos was the preferred policy of the Imperium, the practical reality was far more complex. Not all alien species could be eradicated immediately, and in many cases, their existence was tolerated for the sake of trade, intelligence gathering, or strategic positioning. Rogue traders were uniquely positioned to handle these interactions, often engaging in negotiations and military actions that the Imperium's more rigid institutions could not officially acknowledge. The rogue traders Militant, in particular, were tasked with dealing with hostile alien forces that posed direct threats to Imperial expansion. They operated in the shadows of the Imperium's rigid dogma, striking against enemies in ways that did not always conform to official doctrine. Political maneuvering within the Imperium also played a role. The issuance of rogue trader warrants had always been a tool of political expediency, often granted to influential individuals or noble houses that sought to expand their wealth and influence. However, the militarization of certain rogue traders was driven by more than just strategic necessity. Many of those who received such mandates were individuals with the backing of powerful factions within the Imperium, including elements of the High Lords of Terra, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Mechanicum. These groups saw the establishment of rogue traders Militant as a means of extending their own reach into the distant regions of space. Some were granted control over fleets and armies as a means of securing Imperial interests, while others were given such power to act as proxies for those who wished to maintain influence beyond their own sectors. The sheer scale of the Imperium's territory also contributed to the emergence of these militant warlords. Many regions beyond the core sectors were effectively isolated from the central administration of the Adeptus Terra, forcing local commanders to operate with a degree of independence. Over time, some rogue traders amassed enough power to rival that of established planetary rulers. This was not always the intention of the Imperium, but once granted authority, these individuals often took liberties in interpreting their mandates. Some waged private wars of conquest, while others acted as military governors of entire subsectors, exerting control over populations that had little to no direct contact with the greater Imperium. The gradual breakdown of Imperial logistics in certain regions also made the existence of these militant commanders a necessity. Supplying distant sectors with reinforcements and resources was a slow and inefficient process, leading to prolonged periods where frontier worlds were left to fend for themselves. Rogue traders, militant, operating as self-sufficient entities, filled this void by maintaining their own supply chains and military forces. Their ability to operate independently of the Imperium's central command structure allowed them to act swiftly in response to threats, a capability that was increasingly valued as the Imperium's expansion continued. Religious factors further fueled the rise of these warlords. The spread of the Imperial cult was an integral part of Imperial governance, and rogue traders often played a role in enforcing religious compliance among newly discovered human populations. The Ecclesiarchy, while maintaining its own militant forces, relied on the rogue traders Militant to bring distant worlds into alignment with Imperial doctrine. Many of these militant commanders saw themselves as crusaders, waging holy wars to cleanse the fringes of the Imperium of heresy and unbelief. In some cases, they established their own religious followings, further solidifying their power beyond the watchful eyes of the Ecclesiarchy's central leadership. Despite the seemingly logical reasons behind their existence, the seeds of their downfall were already present at the time of their rise. The very traits that made them effective, their independence, their ability to operate beyond traditional command structures, and their tendency to consolidate power, were the same traits that would eventually lead to conflict with the Imperium's institutions. What began as a necessary solution to the Imperium's expansionist struggles would, in time, become a liability that the central authorities could no longer ignore. The stage was set for their eventual decline, but before that, their influence would reach its peak, marking a period of history where these militant warlords held unprecedented power over the outer reaches of the Imperium. The rise of the rogue traders Militant was not an instantaneous event, but a gradual transformation that unfolded across centuries. Their power expanded in distinct phases, shaped by shifting priorities within the Imperium, the conditions of the frontier, and their own ambitions. These stages saw them evolve from sanctioned agents of expansion to independent warlords, before ultimately becoming a perceived threat to the stability of Imperial rule. The initial phase of their ascent was defined by necessity. As Imperial expansion pressed further into the galaxy, the demand for autonomous commanders capable of handling military and exploratory duties grew. The first rogue traders Militant emerged during this time, granted extensive authority to secure and pacify newly discovered systems. These early figures were closely aligned with the Imperium's strategic goals, acting as instruments of conquest rather than independent rulers. Their mandates were clear: expand Imperial influence, subjugate resistant populations, and establish footholds that could later be assimilated into the Imperium's bureaucratic structure. During this early period, these militant traders operated with the backing of the Imperium's institutions. Their fleets were often reinforced by surplus warships, and their armies were bolstered by detachments from Imperial regiments that could not be easily reassigned elsewhere. They worked in coordination with local governors and military commanders, filling gaps where the formal branches of the Imperium struggled to maintain control. While some of them amassed personal wealth and influence, their role remained tethered to the broader objectives of imperial expansion. As time passed, a second phase began to take shape, marked by increasing autonomy. With each successful conquest, rogue traders Militant expanded their holdings, securing entire regions under their authority. Many of these territories were isolated from the core of the Imperium, allowing them to operate with minimal oversight. The expectation was that they would eventually cede control of these holdings to appointed imperial authorities, but in practice, many of them resisted external interference. They justified this by claiming that their continued governance was necessary for stability, arguing that imperial administrators lacked the experience or resources to maintain order in these volatile regions. This period saw the development of their own military structures, distinct from the centralized forces of the Imperium. While they still relied on imperial support, they also began to recruit and train their own forces. These included mercenaries, planetary militias, and even renegade elements that had been absorbed into their ranks. Their fleets, initially supplemented by imperial vessels, became increasingly independent, with some traders commissioning the construction of new warships through back-channel agreements with the Mechanicum or repurposing captured enemy vessels. This shift led to growing unease among the Imperial Navy and local sector authorities, who viewed their increasing strength with suspicion. As their power solidified, so too did their ambitions. The next stage in their history saw some of them transition from loyal servants of the Imperium to self-styled rulers. While their charters had originally granted them authority over specific regions, many expanded their influence far beyond their original mandates. Some established dynastic rule over multiple systems, treating entire planets as personal holdings. Others carved out independent power bases, forging alliances with Xenos or rogue human factions, actions that placed them at odds with imperial doctrine. It was during this period that conflicts between rogue traders Militant and imperial authorities began to escalate. Some were accused of overstepping their authority, ruling in ways that defied imperial law or resisting orders from higher command. Reports surfaced of certain traders refusing to relinquish control of occupied worlds, demanding recognition as independent rulers rather than mere agents of the Imperium. In some cases, sector lords and imperial governors petitioned the High Lords of Terra to intervene, fearing that these rogue commanders threatened to destabilize entire regions. This growing tension culminated in direct confrontations. Certain rogue traders, unwilling to submit to imperial oversight, openly defied orders to relinquish control of their holdings. Some engaged in outright rebellion, using their fleets and armies to resist imperial forces sent to bring them back in line. These conflicts varied in scale, from localized skirmishes to full-scale military campaigns. The Imperium's response was initially inconsistent. Some rogue commanders were crushed swiftly, while others were granted leniency in exchange for renewed loyalty. However, as their numbers grew and their defiance became more widespread, the Imperium's stance hardened. The final phase of their rise was also the beginning of their decline. Recognizing the growing threat posed by their unchecked power, the Imperium moved to systematically dismantle them. Edicts were passed that restricted their authority, limiting their ability to recruit independent forces or expand their territories. Some were recalled to Terra under false pretenses, only to be stripped of their warrants or executed. Others were declared heretics or traitors, hunted down by the Imperial Navy or the Inquisition. This period saw many of their strongest leaders fall, their fleets shattered, and their territories forcibly reincorporated into the Imperium. Despite these efforts, some remnants endured, retreating into the far reaches of the galaxy where Imperial control was weakest. While their influence was significantly diminished, isolated warlords continued to operate beyond Imperial jurisdiction, lurking in the darkness of the void, waiting for the opportunity to reclaim their former power. The story of the rogue traders Militant was one of ambition and betrayal, of individuals who rose to prominence through the Imperium's need for expansion, only to be cast aside when their strength became a liability. Their downfall was not a single event, but a process that unfolded across centuries, culminating in their near eradication from Imperial history. The decisive moment that marked the turning point in the history of the rogue traders Militant came with the implementation of a formal Imperial decree that fundamentally altered their status within the Imperium. This was not a single battle or betrayal, but a systemic shift in policy, driven by mounting concerns over their unchecked power and increasing defiance. The decree, issued by the High Lords of Terra, was known by many names across different regions, but its intent was clear: to strip rogue traders Militant of their autonomous military authority and bring them fully under Imperial oversight. It was the moment when their existence as independent warlords became untenable. The decision to dismantle their power was not made lightly. For centuries, they had served as essential instruments of Imperial expansion, acting in regions where the formal institutions of the Imperium struggled to maintain control. However, as their influence grew, so did the problems associated with their autonomy. Reports had reached the highest levels of Imperial command, detailing numerous incidents where these militant traders acted beyond their mandates. Some had established hereditary rule over multiple systems, effectively creating dynastic empires that resisted reintegration into the Imperium's bureaucracy. Others had begun operating as mercenary leaders, hiring out their fleets and armies for personal gain, rather than serving the Imperium's strategic interests. Most alarming of all were accusations that some had engaged in negotiations with Xenos factions, forging pacts that violated Imperial doctrine. The tipping point came when a coalition of sector governors and high-ranking military officials presented a case to the High Lords of Terra, arguing that the continued existence of these rogue warlords posed a direct threat to Imperial stability. The coalition, composed of figures from the Imperial Navy, Administratum, and Adeptus Arbites, outlined a pattern of insubordination and outright defiance that could no longer be ignored. They cited instances where rogue traders Militant had refused to cede control of conquered territories, engaged in battles against Imperial forces, and in some cases even declared themselves independent rulers. The response from the High Lords was swift and absolute. The decree that followed was unprecedented in scope. It revoked the autonomous military privileges of all rogue traders Militant, requiring them to submit their fleets and armies to direct Imperial oversight. Their personal control over planetary holdings was dissolved, with all territories claimed under their rule transferred to the jurisdiction of local Imperial commanders. Any who refused to comply were declared enemies of the Imperium, to be hunted down and eliminated. The edict made it clear that no individual, no matter how powerful, could be permitted to operate outside the rigid command structure of the Imperium. The immediate consequences of this decree were catastrophic for the rogue traders Militant. Many, particularly those who had integrated themselves into the political structure of the Imperium, chose to comply, surrendering their private forces and accepting lesser roles within the Imperium's hierarchy. However, others refused, seeing this decree as a betrayal of the authority they had been granted. Some attempted to negotiate, arguing that their role was still necessary, but they quickly realized that there was no room for compromise. The Imperium had made its decision, and there was no turning back. For those who resisted, the response was swift and brutal. The Imperial Navy launched targeted operations against rogue fleets that refused to disband, systematically dismantling their once powerful forces. The Adeptus Arbites and the Inquisition carried out purges on worlds where former rogue traders still held influence, ensuring that their power bases were completely eradicated. Some tried to fight back, leading to desperate last stands in the void and planetary sieges, where they sought to hold on to what little remained of their authority. A few even turned to outright rebellion, hoping to rally support among dissatisfied Imperial commanders or sympathetic planetary rulers, but these efforts were quickly crushed. The Imperium had learned from past insurrections and moved with overwhelming force to eliminate all remaining threats. One of the most significant consequences of this decision was the erasure of their legacy from official Imperial records. The Administratum, under directives from the highest authorities, began a campaign to systematically remove references to the rogue traders Militant from historical accounts. Their achievements, their battles, and even their existence were gradually erased or rewritten to fit the new narrative. In time, they became little more than myths, spoken of in hushed tones among voidfarers and frontier settlements, but absent from any sanctioned histories of the Imperium's expansion. Only a few scattered records remained, locked away in the archives of the Inquisition or hidden within restricted Mechanicum databanks. Despite this decree, remnants of their influence persisted in the shadows. Some surviving rogue traders fled into the furthest reaches of space, beyond the Imperium's reach, where they continued to operate in secrecy. Others integrated into hidden factions, biding their time and waiting for an opportunity to reclaim their former power. Yet, for all their efforts, they could never regain what had been lost. The age of the rogue traders Militant was over, not because of a single battle or betrayal, but because the Imperium had deemed their existence a threat to its absolute authority. This was the moment when their story shifted from one of dominance to one of survival. No longer warlords, they became fugitives, relics of an era that the Imperium sought to forget. The decree that ended their reign ensured that no future warlord could ever rise to challenge the Imperium's rule in the same way again. It was a reminder that, in the Imperium of man, power was not a privilege to be wielded freely. It was a tool to be controlled, and those who strayed too far from its grasp would be brought to ruin. The dissolution of the rogue traders Militant left a profound mark on the galaxy, reshaping the balance of power across multiple regions. Their eradication was not a simple administrative change, but a violent and destabilizing process that sent shockwaves through the Imperium, its military, its economy, and the farthest reaches of human-settled space. Entire sectors, once governed under their rule, faced sudden and often chaotic transitions as Imperial authorities struggled to impose direct control over territories that had operated under independent warlords for generations. One of the most immediate consequences was the destabilization of frontier regions. Many of these territories had been under the governance of rogue traders Militant, who maintained order through personal armies and extensive networks of alliances. When they were removed, the void they left behind led to widespread disorder. Some planetary populations, having grown accustomed to their rule, resisted attempts to reintegrate into the wider Imperium. In some cases, these worlds descended into rebellion, refusing to acknowledge new Imperial administrators who lacked the authority and force necessary to maintain control. Others fell into lawlessness, with local power struggles erupting as warlords, former officers, and planetary elites vied for dominance in the absence of their previous rulers. The Imperial Navy and the Astra Militarum were forced to divert considerable resources to secure these now unstable sectors. While some planets submitted to Imperial rule without conflict, others became the sites of prolonged campaigns to crush uprisings or eliminate rogue elements. The process of re-establishing control stretched the Imperium's forces thin, particularly as conflicts elsewhere in the galaxy continued to demand attention. Several regions that had once served as stable outposts of Imperial expansion became war zones, undoing decades of progress. In some cases, the Imperium simply abandoned these sectors, leaving them to be reclaimed by pirates, exiled rogue traders, or worse, invading Xenos forces. The economic impact of their downfall was another significant consequence. Rogue traders Militant had not only been warlords, but also key figures in the trade networks that spanned the Imperium's outer regions. They had established supply chains, secured rare resources, and facilitated commerce between distant settlements and core imperial worlds. With their sudden removal, many of these routes collapsed, leading to shortages of vital materials. Forge worlds that had relied on raw resources from these distant holdings faced production slowdowns, affecting the supply of weapons, ships, and war machines needed for imperial campaigns. Merchant fleets, once protected under agreements with rogue traders Militant, now found themselves vulnerable to raiders and hostile forces lurking in the void. The Imperium's political structure also felt the aftershocks. The removal of these independent military commanders resulted in a greater concentration of power within the Adeptus Terra. The High Lords of Terra, having successfully eliminated a class of autonomous warlords, tightened control over the issuance of rogue trader warrants. Future generations of rogue traders were granted far more limited authority, with strict regulations ensuring that no individual could amass the same level of military power again. While this reinforced the Imperium's centralization, it also made it less adaptable. The flexibility and initiative once provided by these warlords were gone, replaced by slower-moving bureaucracies that struggled to respond to emerging threats. Among the lesser-known but equally important consequences was the fate of the surviving elements of these militant factions. While most of their forces were dismantled or absorbed into the broader imperial structure, some remnants persisted. Scattered warbands of exiled rogue traders and their former soldiers vanished into the depths of space, seeking refuge in uncharted regions beyond the Imperium's reach. Some of these remnants became notorious pirate fleets, preying on imperial shipping lanes and establishing hidden strongholds in lawless systems. Others sought sanctuary among Xeno civilizations, forging uneasy alliances to ensure their survival. A few even resurfaced within the Imperium, operating in secret under false identities, their influence hidden but not entirely erased. The Inquisition took a particular interest in the remaining survivors, recognizing the potential threat posed by those who had once commanded private armies and vast resources. Across multiple sectors, hidden operations were conducted to track down and eliminate those who might seek to restore their former power. Some were executed in public purges, their fates serving as a warning to others, while others disappeared quietly, their names erased from records as if they had never existed. The Inquisition's involvement ensured that even those who attempted to reintegrate into imperial society remained under constant scrutiny, their pasts never truly forgotten. The vacuum left by their absence also emboldened external threats. In regions where rogue traders Militant had once held the line against alien incursions, new dangers emerged. Xenos warbands that had previously been kept at bay by these independent warlords now found opportunities to expand. Orc invasions increased in several sectors, with war bosses seizing abandoned strongholds and launching new offensives. Other alien species, long held in check by the brutal policies of these militant traders, began reclaiming lost territories. Imperial forces were slow to react, with the Navy and Astra Militarum spread thin, allowing some of these incursions to escalate beyond what had previously been thought possible. Religious and cultural shifts also accompanied their downfall. Many rogue traders Militant had cultivated their own interpretations of the imperial creed, with some forming dedicated warrior cults that blended elements of their personal beliefs with mainstream imperial doctrine. These groups, once held together by their leaders, fractured in the wake of their demise. Some integrated into existing ecclesiarchy structures, while others turned to radical sects that viewed their fallen commanders as martyrs. The ecclesiarchy, while officially condemning any deviation from its teachings, struggled to fully erase the influence that these militant figures had left behind. The final consequence of their fall was the transformation of imperial policy regarding future expansion. No longer willing to entrust individuals with unchecked military power, the Imperium became increasingly reliant on bureaucratic oversight and slow-moving strategic planning. This shift led to greater inefficiencies, with exploration and conquest becoming more tightly regulated, often at the cost of lost opportunities. While this ensured that no new warlords could rise to challenge the Imperium's authority, it also made it more difficult to respond to emerging threats on the frontier. In the long term, this rigidity would contribute to the Imperium's struggles in maintaining control over its vast domain. The eradication of the rogue traders militant was meant to be a solution to a growing problem, but in its wake, it left an Imperium that was less flexible, more vulnerable in certain regions, and burdened with the unintended consequences of eliminating one of its most dynamic forces. Their downfall reshaped the galaxy, ensuring that while their names were erased from history, their impact would continue to be felt for centuries to come. Among the figures who shaped the rise and fall of the rogue traders militant, several individuals stood out as defining personalities, each embodying the strengths and weaknesses of their kind. These were commanders, conquerors, and visionaries who sought to bend the frontier to their will, driven by ambition, necessity, or personal conviction. Some were celebrated as heroes of expansion, while others became cautionary tales of unchecked power. One of the most infamous was Lord Captain Varro Gethric a tactician whose brilliance in naval warfare was matched only by his defiance of imperial authority. His methods were unorthodox, often rejecting standard fleet doctrine in favor of deception, rapid strikes, and psychological warfare. Gethric saw his command as an art, where each battle was not merely a contest of firepower, but of strategy, patience, and calculated risk. Under his leadership, entire sectors were brought under imperial control with minimal loss of life, at least among those he considered worthy of survival. He held a deep disdain for bureaucracy, seeing it as an impediment to the Imperium's potential, and this ultimately led to his undoing. His refusal to submit his forces to official oversight after the decree dissolving rogue traders militant made him a target. Though his fleet held out for longer than expected, a betrayal from within ensured his capture. His execution was made public, intended as a message to others who might follow in his footsteps. Another pivotal figure was Seraphine Daltrus known for her ability to balance diplomacy and military force with cold precision. Unlike many of her peers, she understood that brute strength alone would not secure lasting power. She built an empire of influence, using calculated marriages, political alliances, and economic agreements to extend her reach. Seraphine had an almost supernatural ability to read people, using this skill to manipulate allies and enemies alike. Her downfall came not from military defeat, but from the shifting tides of imperial politics. When the decree against the rogue traders militant was issued, she attempted to negotiate her way out of irrelevance, but her name had already been marked for erasure. Stripped of her power, she vanished into obscurity, her fate unknown. Some rumors suggest she faked her death and continued to operate in the shadows, but no verifiable record of her existence remained. Where others relied on strategy or diplomacy, Brannis Kell was a warrior above all else. A towering presence on the battlefield, he led from the front, clad in custom-forged armor that bore the scars of countless campaigns. He believed that strength was the only currency that mattered, and that the Imperium's survival depended on its ability to conquer without hesitation. His forces were known for their relentless discipline, trained to fight in the harshest conditions with unwavering loyalty. Despite his reputation for brutality, he was not a mindless berserker. He understood war as a tool for shaping the future. When the Imperium moved to strip power from the rogue traders militant, he refused to surrender, leading a desperate resistance that lasted years longer than expected. His final stand became legend, a siege that saw his forces whittled down to a handful of loyalists before he was overwhelmed. His last words, spoken before a firing squad, were said to be a warning that the Imperium's own rigidity would lead to its eventual downfall. Not all figures associated with the rogue traders militant were warriors. Alera Voskar was known less for her military conquests and more for her mastery of information and subterfuge. She understood that war was often won before a battle even began, and she used intelligence networks, spies, and misinformation to control entire systems without firing a shot. Her methods were subtle, often leaving her enemies unaware of their defeat until it was too late. Alera's greatest strength was her ability to disappear. Whenever authorities came too close, she would slip into the void, always one step ahead. She was instrumental in keeping several dissident factions within the Imperium in check, using blackmail and carefully planted rumors to manipulate planetary rulers and sector governors. However, once the Imperium turned against her kind, her survival skills were put to the test in ways she had never anticipated. The last known record of her activities places her in a distant, uncharted region of space, her fate unknown. Some believe she still operates in the void, a ghost in the Imperium's forgotten corners, waiting for the right moment to strike. While many rogue traders Militant fought against their downfall, some played a key role in ensuring it. Commodore Felian Orsic was among the first to betray his fellow warlords, recognizing that resistance was futile. A pragmatic and calculating figure, he willingly turned against his peers, offering intelligence, fleet positions, and supply routes to Imperial authorities in exchange for his own survival. His actions accelerated the collapse of the remaining rogue factions, providing the Imperium with the information needed to dismantle their forces efficiently. For his service, he was granted a position within the Imperial Navy, though he was never fully trusted. His betrayal earned him many enemies, and he was eventually assassinated under mysterious circumstances. His killers were never found, though many suspect it was the work of former associates who had not forgotten his role in their downfall. Among the most enigmatic figures was Hadric Sithrin ***, a rogue warlord whose ambitions stretched beyond mere military conquest. He was a collector of knowledge, obsessed with lost artifacts, forbidden technologies, and the hidden history of humanity's past. His fleets were not only warships, but also vast archives, carrying relics and records that many within the Imperium sought to destroy. Some claimed he had uncovered secrets that could challenge the foundations of Imperial rule, making him one of the most dangerous figures of his time. When the decree dissolving the rogue traders Militant was issued, he disappeared, taking his knowledge with him. Theories regarding his fate range from self-imposed exile to secret dealings with shadowy forces beyond the Imperium's borders. Some whisper that his legacy lives on, hidden in the depths of space, waiting to be rediscovered. Each of these figures represented different aspects of what made the rogue traders Militant both formidable and dangerous. Some were conquerors, others manipulators, and a few were visionaries who saw beyond the rigid constraints of Imperial doctrine. Their rise was fueled by ambition and necessity, but their downfall was inevitable in a galaxy that could not tolerate unchecked power. Whether they met their end in battle, through betrayal, or in the obscurity of exile, their influence did not vanish entirely. Their stories lived on in scattered records, whispered rumors, and the silent acknowledgement that, for a time, they had shaped the course of Imperial history in ways few could ever hope to achieve. The history of the rogue traders Militant is filled with unanswered questions and lingering mysteries that continue to spark debate among scholars, archivists, and those who operate in the shadows of the Imperium. Their sudden rise, unchecked power, and abrupt fall have left gaps in the official record, fueling speculation about the true reasons behind their eradication and what may still remain hidden in the depths of space. One of the most persistent questions concerns the real motivations behind the High Lords of Terra's decision to dismantle the rogue traders Militant. The official explanation, that they had become a threat to the Imperium's unity and stability, appears logical on the surface, yet many argue that it does not fully account for the scale and swiftness of the purge. Rogue traders had always operated with a degree of independence, and while some certainly pushed the limits of their authority, it remains unclear why the Imperium moved so aggressively against all of them rather than targeting only the most rebellious figures. Some theories suggest that there were hidden factors at play, such as internal power struggles within the Adeptus Terra, the Inquisition's concerns over certain discoveries made by these warlords, or even secret agreements with external factions that required their removal. Another major mystery revolves around the supposed destruction of their archives. Rogue traders Militant had access to some of the most unfiltered information in the Imperium, having encountered uncharted worlds, lost human civilizations, and Xenos knowledge that was otherwise deemed forbidden. Many of their fleets were not just war machines, but also mobile repositories of data, carrying records that could challenge the carefully maintained narrative of Imperial history. When their forces were dismantled, these archives were supposedly destroyed or absorbed into classified Imperial records. Yet, rumors persist that not all of this information was lost. Some speculate that hidden caches of their knowledge still exist in remote sectors, sealed away in forgotten strongholds or carried by surviving remnants who continue to evade Imperial detection. The fate of certain key figures among the rogue traders Militant also remains unresolved. While many of their most prominent leaders were executed or otherwise accounted for, others simply vanished. Individuals who had commanded vast fleets and armies disappeared without a trace, their final actions unknown. Some believe that a number of them managed to escape beyond the fringes of Imperial space, possibly establishing hidden enclaves far from Imperial jurisdiction. These supposed exiles could still possess functional fleets, secret supply chains, and enough resources to challenge Imperial authority should they ever return. The idea of a scattered but still dangerous remnant of rogue traders Militant operating in the depths of the void is a source of paranoia for certain elements of the Inquisition and the Navy. Equally mysterious is the possibility that some within the Imperium itself may have secretly preserved elements of the rogue traders Militant for their own purposes. While the official purge was thorough, there have been scattered reports throughout history of ships bearing their heraldry appearing in war zones or distant territories long after they were thought to be extinct. Some believe that certain Inquisitors, Mechanicum factions, or rogue elements within the Navy may have covertly retained the services of these exiled warlords, using them as deniable assets for missions that could not be officially sanctioned. If true, this would mean that the Imperium's own forces may still be benefiting from the same militarized traders they once sought to destroy. A particularly controversial theory suggests that some rogue traders Militant may have made contact with entities or knowledge forbidden even by the standards of the Imperium. Throughout their expansion, they encountered countless worlds and civilizations, many of which had access to technology or abilities that the Imperium would never officially acknowledge. Some speculate that these warlords uncovered something so dangerous or destabilizing that the High Lords had no choice but to eliminate them before they could reveal it. Whether this was lost human technology, evidence of an alternate past, or contact with unknown entities remains unknown, but the sheer effort put into erasing their existence suggests that they may have possessed information the Imperium could not allow to spread. Another lingering question is whether their military doctrines and fleet compositions were truly lost, or if they have been integrated into other Imperial organizations under different names. The tactics they employed, independent fleet actions, rapid territorial control, and adaptive warfare, do not align with standard Navy doctrine, yet elements of these strategies have surfaced in later conflicts. This raises the question of whether certain sectors within the Imperium, particularly those involved in high-risk frontier operations, have quietly adopted their methods while publicly denying any association. If so, it would suggest that while the rogue traders Militant were erased from history, their influence remains embedded within Imperial military thought. The potential existence of rogue enclaves controlled by the descendants or remnants of these warlords is another topic of speculation. Some Imperial expeditions have reported coming across human-controlled systems operating under unknown governance, often exhibiting military structures and fleet formations that bear striking similarities to the old rogue trader militant model. While official records dismiss these as isolated rogue elements or breakaway colonies, there are those who believe they may be the last remnants of an erased empire, still holding on to the traditions of their former rulers. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is whether any of them could ever return. The Imperium is vast, and its control over its own borders is far from absolute. If even a fraction of the rogue traders' militants survived and continued to operate in secrecy, they could still wield significant influence in the shadows. The idea that an organized resurgence could occur is dismissed by most as mere speculation, but within the higher circles of Imperial authority, the fear of such a possibility lingers. The Navy, the Inquisition, and other key institutions remain vigilant, ensuring that should any trace of their former power re-emerge, it is swiftly dealt with before it can grow into a true threat. Though the rogue traders militant were erased from official history, the questions surrounding their legacy remain unanswered. Their impact lingers in uncharted systems, in forgotten records buried within the Imperium's deepest vaults, and in the minds of those who suspect that their story is far from over. Whether they are truly gone or merely waiting for the right moment to reappear remains one of the most enduring and unsettling mysteries of Imperial history. The question of whether there are truly friendly Xenos in the galaxy carries implications that extend far beyond philosophical or ideological debates. It is a subject that, if ever addressed openly, could reshape the Imperium's future, affecting its military strategies, political structures, and the fundamental nature of its existence. For now, Imperial doctrine leaves no room for such considerations, maintaining an unwavering stance of hostility toward all non-human species. However, as the galaxy continues to change, long-term consequences may emerge that challenge this rigid stance, forcing new paradigms of interaction, whether through necessity, survival, or unforeseen shifts in power. One potential long-term consequence is the eventual realization that the Imperium's war against all Xenos is unsustainable. As humanity continues to struggle against overwhelming threats, widespread wars, dwindling resources, and the ever-present encroachment of hostile alien forces, the cost of maintaining absolute xenophobia may become too great. A galaxy consumed by eternal war has left Imperial forces stretched thin, and the idea of exterminating every alien species is increasingly impractical. If internal pressures continue to rise, there may come a point where certain factions within the Imperium begin to push for a reassessment of Xenos relations, not out of ideology, but out of sheer survival. While the current state of the Imperium leaves little room for diplomacy, certain Xenos factions have already demonstrated that they are capable of coexistence under limited conditions. This is particularly relevant in regions where human and alien civilizations have been forced into long-term proximity, leading to unofficial and often unacknowledged interactions. Some isolated human colonies have developed symbiotic relationships with minor Xenos species, relying on trade or shared defense against greater threats. While these instances are not recognized by the Imperium, they suggest a reality that cannot be easily erased. There are Xenos groups that do not pose an immediate existential threat, and some have even displayed behavior that could be interpreted as cooperation rather than aggression. The long-term impact of this realization, should it ever reach the highest levels of Imperial power, would be profound. If the Imperium were to acknowledge even a fraction of these interactions, it could lead to a strategic reconfiguration of how it approaches its enemies. Rather than indiscriminately waging war against all non-humans, certain groups could be deemed less of a priority, shifting the focus toward more immediate threats. This would not be a true alliance. Imperial doctrine is unlikely to ever allow such a drastic shift, but a tactical acceptance that some Xenos may be more useful alive than eradicated. Such a change would be subtle and likely unspoken, but it could alter the nature of warfare across multiple sectors. On the other hand, the long-term consequences of recognizing certain Xenos as potential allies or lesser threats could lead to a schism within the Imperium itself. The idea of even tolerating Xenos' presence is heresy under the current framework of Imperial law, and any movement toward coexistence would be met with fierce resistance from the Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, and countless other entrenched institutions. The Imperium thrives on its monolithic hatred of all things alien, and any deviation from this stance risks internal division. If enough evidence of friendly Xenos were to surface, factions could emerge that either advocate for cautious engagement or double down on purging any deviation from the existing doctrine. Such internal strife could weaken the Imperium, diverting resources from critical battles and creating opportunities for external enemies to exploit. Beyond ideological struggles, the acknowledgement of non-hostile Xenos could have significant political ramifications. The Adeptus Mechanicus, long known for its pragmatic approach to knowledge acquisition, might seize the opportunity to justify limited interactions with certain alien species in pursuit of advanced technology. Rogue elements within the Inquisition, already known for operating outside traditional boundaries, could use the existence of such Xenos groups to further their own agendas. Meanwhile, planetary governors and isolated Imperial commanders, faced with impossible logistical challenges, might quietly form unofficial agreements with alien species to ensure their own survival. Over time, these individual cases could accumulate into something far more significant, a slow erosion of the absolute doctrine of xenophobia that has defined the Imperium for millennia. Even if the Imperium itself remains rigid in its policies, there's always the possibility that breakaway human factions could emerge, willing to explore alternative paths. Lost colonies, isolated warlords, or splinter groups cut off from the Imperium's direct control could begin forming alliances with alien civilizations in defiance of established doctrine. If such factions were to grow in power, they could challenge the narrative that humanity must stand alone. While the Imperium would inevitably attempt to crush any such movements, the mere existence of alternative models of human-Xenos coexistence could plant the seeds of doubt among Imperial citizens, forcing them to question the absolutism of their own civilization. Another long-term consequence of encountering friendly Xenos is the potential for entirely new forms of warfare. If the Imperium were to adapt its strategies to incorporate, exploit, or manipulate certain alien species, it could lead to unprecedented developments in military doctrine. Specialized units might emerge trained to deal with particular Xenos threats not through brute force, but through tactical maneuvering, negotiation, or psychological warfare. Entire campaigns could be waged not for extermination, but for control over alien factions that may be useful as tools against greater threats. While this would not represent an ideological shift toward peace, it would mark a departure from the rigid, unthinking extermination tactics that have characterized Imperial expansion for thousands of years. However, the most unpredictable consequence of acknowledging friendly Xenos is the potential for unintended cultural shifts. Even within the rigid structure of the Imperium, exposure to alien civilizations has, in some cases, led to changes in human beliefs, behaviors, and perspectives. This is a dangerous reality that the Ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition work tirelessly to suppress, yet history has shown that isolation is not always possible. If interactions with certain Xenos groups continue, whether openly or in secret, the very nature of what it means to be part of the Imperium could begin to change in ways that cannot be controlled. This could manifest in new ideological movements, alternative interpretations of the Imperial Creed, or even the gradual erosion of the absolute belief in human supremacy. Ultimately, the long-term implications of friendly Xenos in the galaxy depend on whether the Imperium remains steadfast in its current ideology, or if the relentless pressures of war, survival, and shifting power structures force it to adapt. While it is unlikely that humanity will ever embrace true alliances with alien species, History has shown that survival often dictates change. The Imperium may one day find itself at a crossroads where the choice is not between extermination and coexistence, but between rigid doctrine and the pragmatic realities of an ever-evolving galaxy. Whether such a shift would lead to a stronger Imperium or a fractured one remains an open question, but one thing is certain: the presence of Xenos in the galaxy is not something that can be ignored forever.